We'll talk a little bit now about the basics of the Idaho legislature. There are 35 legislative districts that cover the entire state, and one district elects one senator and 2 representatives. The House of Representatives, therefore, has 70 members, and the Senate has 35 members. And even though I'm mathematically challenged, I'm capable of making those elementary calculations. Both representatives and senators are elected to 2-year terms in November of even-numbered years. So both the senators and representatives serve 2-year terms. The legislative districts are redrawn every 10 years following the federal census to reflect changing population. And following a constitutional amendment in 1994, redistricting has been carried out by an independent bipartisan redistricting commission. The commission is responsible for drawing districts with nearly equal population. So the districts created during the 2011 redistricting effort originally included approximately 44,800 people. The Idaho Constitution provides 3 required qualifications for members of the Idaho legislature. You must be a United States citizen, you must be a registered elector of the state of Idaho, and you must reside in the legislative district for at least 1 year prior to the election. Regular sessions of the Idaho legislature convene each year at noon on the Monday on or nearest to January 9th. There's also the possibility for special sessions that may be called by the governor to address specific issues, and these are limited to 20 days in length. Prior to 1969, the legislature met on a biennial basis and met every odd-numbered year. A constitutional amendment was passed in 1968 to move the state to annual legislative sessions. And while many states have constitutional restrictions on the length of their legislative sessions, Idaho does not. For instance, Utah's constitution actually limits their legislative sessions to 45 calendar days. And Idaho has no such limitations, and our sessions can go as long as they need to. And frankly, that's helpful in allowing controversial issues to be resolved in a reasonable way. Although it does mean that our legislative sessions can be long sometimes. And the length of the legislative session varies considerably depending on the issues involved, potentially controversial issues, and whether tax increases are being considered. The indications are that this year's session will likely be short, as we don't see any really bitterly contentious issues on the horizon, and legislators want to get back home to start campaigning for the May 17th primary election. An example of how a legislative session can go long is in 2009, when the governor and legislature went to battle over the issue of transportation funding. Governor Otter vetoed 36 bills late in the session, including a lot of budget bills that the legislature had to go back and repass. And that session, which I still have flashbacks from, was the second longest in Idaho history and went on for 117 days. So the length of the session really depends on the particular issues and whether any issues will be controversial or there are any tax increases that are being considered. This slide shows the length of session in days from 2006 to 2015. And in 2009, you'll see the outlier of 117 days. But the bonus was in the following year in 2010, which was a sweet, short 78-day session. So the really long legislative sessions tend to be followed up by really short ones, which is the good news. But the average, as you see, is about the mid to high 80s in terms of the number of days in a legislative session. Bill volume is another statistic that can give you some helpful gauges about the productivity of the legislature and how many bills are considered. And this slide shows the decline in bill volume from 2006 to 2015. Really, the peak was in 2006 when there were over 1,100 pieces of legislation that were drafted by the Legislative Services Office. Now we're down to about 763, which is a pretty significant decline in legislation introduced. The green bar represents bills that are actually introduced, which in Idaho generally happens when a committee votes to print the legislation. And so you'll see that the number of bills introduced is a pretty sharp decline from the pieces of legislation that are drafted. The committee introduction process really helps to choke down the number of bills that are introduced into a reasonable number. And then the red bar shows the bills that are actually passed into law. And each year we pass about 350 bills into law in the state of Idaho. And it's generally about half of the pieces of legislation that are drafted in that year by the Legislative Services Office. So the long-term trend is for the volume of legislation actually going down. On the first day of the legislative session, the House and Senate convene in a joint session to hear the governor's State of the State address, which we just heard last week, and the speech outlines the governor's policy and budget priorities. We will talk a little bit now about legislative leadership and the presiding officers in the House and Senate. The Idaho Constitution designates the Lieutenant Governor of Idaho as President of the Senate. Brad Little currently serves as Idaho's Lieutenant Governor. The Lieutenant Governor is elected by Idaho voters to serve a term of 4 years. The Lieutenant Governor is not actually a member of the Senate, but they are the presiding officer. And so their role includes overseeing Senate floor sessions, ruling on parliamentary points of order, signing bills and joint resolutions passed by the Senate, and most importantly, casting tie-breaking votes when the Senate is equally divided. Lieutenant Governor Little jokes that he has to read every bill, and he actually does in case he has to vote on it if there's a tie. So their role is still important, but they are the presiding officer, but not actually a member of the body. The Senate selects a president pro tempore, who's referred to as the pro tem, who is a member of the Senate and presides over the Senate in the absence of the Lieutenant Governor. The currently serving pro tem is Senator Brent Hill of Rexburg. And the pro tem oversees much of the day-to-day business of the Senate, including referring bills to committee, controlling the chamber, rooms, passages, and corridors of the Senate when it's in session, and appointing members of committees and committee chairs, which is a very important consideration. Unlike the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House is a member of the House and can vote on all the bills that the House votes on. So the Speaker of the House is actually a member of the House and is elected by the members of the House. The Speaker's responsibilities include overseeing floor sessions, ruling on parliamentary questions, referring bills to committee, and appointing members of committees and committee chairs. The currently serving Speaker of the House is Representative Scott Bedke of Oakley. The majority and minority party in the House and Senate each elect a majority or minority leader, an assistant majority or minority leader, and a majority or minority caucus chair as their party's leadership. The roles of the party leadership include overseeing action on the floor, making motions on behalf of the party on the floor, determining the party strategy, disseminating information to party members, lining up party members for key votes, and the caucus chair presides over party caucuses, which are private meetings to discuss strategy and share information. Much of the work in the legislative process occurs in committees, which allow legislators to develop expertise in certain policy areas. Legislators are assigned to committees by the Speaker of the House and pro tem, who take into account generally seniority and the preferences of the individual members. Committee chairs are also appointed by the Speaker and Pro Tem, normally taking into account seniority on the committee. Committee chairs wield considerable power and have the ability to kill bills they don't like by refusing to give them a hearing, which is known as putting the bill in the drawer. Here's a list of several committees to watch, the committees that cities generally interact with most in the Idaho legislature. On the House side, the Commerce and Human Resources Committee is chaired by Representative Stephen Hartgen of Twin Falls. This committee deals with labor issues, minimum wage, unions, and PERSI. The House Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee is chaired by Representative Jeff Thompson of Idaho Falls, and it deals with hazardous waste, water and sewer rulemaking, particularly from DEQ, air quality issues, and recycling. The House Judiciary Rules and Administration Committee is chaired by Representative Rich Wills of Glens Ferry, and it deals with primarily courts, law enforcement, and prisons. So the police chiefs often interact with the Judiciary and Rules Committee. Local government is our main committee on the House side. It's chaired by Representative Lynn Luker of Boise, and it deals with issues specific to cities and counties, as well as special districts, and also urban renewal. The House Resources and Conservation Committee is chaired by Representative Dull Raybould of Rexburg, and deals with water rights, oil and gas, mining, and fish and game issues. The House Revenue and Taxation Committee is chaired by Representative Gary Collins of Nampa, and deals with property, sales, and income tax issues. It's a tremendously important committee, and for cities, probably the second in importance to the Local Government Committee. House State Affairs Committee is chaired by Representative Tom Lurcher of Iona, and it deals with statewide policy issues, including elections, firearms, alcohol regulation, and abortion. The House Transportation and Defense Committee is chaired by Representative Joe Palmer of Meridian, and it deals with fuel taxes, state and local roads, and motor vehicle regulation. The House Ways and Means Committee is a unique committee in that it doesn't have a specific area of policy that it covers. It covers any policy-making area, but it is the committee of the House leadership, House Majority Leadership, and specifically the Speaker of the House, that's used to quickly introduce or stop legislation. So if you see that a bill has been referred to the House Ways and Means Committee, this generally means that it's the kiss of death, and you need to be very concerned about what's going on. The committee is chaired by Representative Christy Perry of Nampa. The Senate committees to watch include Senate Commerce and Human Resources, which is chaired by Senator Jim Patrick of Twin Falls. And like the House counterpart, that committee deals with labor issues, minimum wage issues, unions, and PERSI. Like the House Jude and Rules Committee, the Senate Judiciary and Rules Committee deals with courts, law enforcement, and prisons. It's chaired by Senator Patty Ann Lodge. The Local Government and Taxation Committee in the Senate actually brings together two of the committees from the House side. So the House has a separate Local Government Committee and then a Rev and Tax Committee, but on the Senate side, these are brought together into one committee, a Local Government and Taxation Committee. The chair is Senator Jeff Sidaway of Terraton, and it deals with all of the local government issues as well as all of the tax issues and urban renewal. So it's a very important committee for cities. The Senate Resources and Environment Committee is chaired by Senator Steve Baer of Blackfoot and deals with water rights. Senate State Affairs, like its counterpart on the House side, deals with the major state policy issues. The Senate State Affairs Committee is chaired by Senator Kurt McKenzie of Nampa. And finally, the Senate Transportation Committee is chaired by Senator Burt Brackett of Three Creek and deals with transportation issues, transportation funding, and motor vehicles. One of the most important committees in the legislature is the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, known as JFAC, and it's composed of the Senate Finance Committee and House Appropriations Committee, which come together to meet as a joint budget committee. JFAC reviews the budget requests from each state department, agency, and institution, including a request for construction of capital improvements. And JFAC drafts appropriation bills that set the legal spending authority for state agencies and departments. And these appropriation bills are nearly always approved by the full legislature.